Hello, and welcome to the second Green Book pod, produced in association with Liberal Democrat Podcast. Our aim in this series is to explore the major challenges facing the country and to discuss what the Liberal Democrat response should be. We'll be featuring both external experts and party insiders. My name is Duncan Brack. 10 years ago, we launched the Green Book, New Directions for Liberals in Government. We aim to contribute to the debate about the challenges facing the next Parliament and the need for innovative green solutions that the Liberal Democrats could adopt. 10 years later, the political context is obviously very different, but our belief remains that there is a massive opportunity for the Liberal Democrats to set out an agenda for making a real difference, but only by identifying innovative, radical, and robust solutions with realistic strategies to deliver them. So that's the aim behind this podcast series. In October, we looked at the economic challenges facing the country, and in December, we'll consider the question of the Liberal Democrats' position on Europe. But this time, we're discussing the challenges of reaching net zero. So to manage the discussion, I'll hand over to Josh Babarinde.
Thank you very much, Duncan. It's wonderful to join you to help chair this podcast and to help chair what I know is going to be a juicy discussion between our wonderful guests, who I'll introduce in a minute. But let me set some context for this particular episode in the podcast. It's no secret, I hope, that climate change is the biggest threat that humanity faces. It's directly contributing to humanitarian emergencies, whether heat waves or wildfires, floods, tropical storms, hurricanes, and they are increasing in scale, in frequency, and in intensity. And I'm afraid, the UK just isn't doing anywhere near enough to meet its legally binding net zero target. That's to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 100% from 1990 levels by 2050. Now, according to Ipsos Mori, the pollster, more than 3 in 4 Britons are concerned about climate change. Polling by More in Common consistently shows that British voters see climate change and the environment as one of the top issues facing the country. And this is heartening. This is the route to action. And these figures show remarkable increases actually from just a few years ago. Now, the Conservative government has a patchy record at best on the issue. And over recent months, the Prime Minister has backtracked on key net zero policies as he tries to draw new political dividing lines, whether it's via the war on motorists that he's spoken about, whether it's the war on woke, etc., etc. Now, Labour have promised a multi-billion-pound green prosperity plan, but they keep pushing back on its timetable and on its scope. Now, this podcast examines the place of the Liberal Democrats in the net zero debate. We were the first UK political party to publish a comprehensive climate change policy in the 90s, the first to set a net zero target for 2050. We did that 16 years ago. And Lib Dems in coalition that Duncan was very involved in presided over a quadrupling of renewable energy and established the world's first green investment bank. But where do we stand now? Do the Liberal Democrats have the robust policies needed to achieve the UK's net zero targets and at the same time build lasting prosperity? What sorts of new eye-catching net zero policies should the party consider? And how should the party present its net zero policies to the public so that they help to make the party and this mission more attractive to voters? Well, with us to discuss these very questions and more are 3 experts who are going to help us navigate through this discussion. So our first guest is Tom Burke. Tom is co-founder and chair of the E3G think tank. He's also a visiting honorary professor at Imperial and University Colleges London and a senior associate of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He's a former executive director of Friends of the Earth and of Green Alliance, and has been a senior advisor for a number of major companies, including BP and Standard Chartered Bank. We've also got James Murray with us. James is the founding editor of Business Green, having launched the site in October 2007. James is responsible for Business Green's leading news, opinion and analysis and contributes to the brand's expanding events programme. James is one of the UK's leading commentators on the low carbon economy. He reports and comments daily on a wide range of green business issues, with a particular focus on low carbon policy, economics, and technology. And last but by no means least, Chris Willmore is Emeritus Professor at University of Bristol's Law School. Her background is in environmental and planning law. Chris is a former professor of sustainability and law with a focus on education for sustainable development in higher education and planning law. And she's currently a cabinet member for planning, regeneration and infrastructure at South Gloucestershire Council. And who am I? I'm Josh Babarinde. I'm standing to be the Liberal Democrats' next Member of Parliament in the sunniest town in the UK. That is Eastbourne. So let's dive into the discussion. Thank you so much for joining, folks. We're going to kick off by talking a little bit about where the Liberal Democrats are now. What is our current position? And just to remind listeners about where we're at to set the scene before I bring our speakers in, the party aims to achieve net zero emissions by 2045 rather than 2050. The strategy is to achieve major emissions reductions in both heating homes and power sector decarbonisation, and then to have longer, more gradual cuts in emissions in all the other sectors, plus a big land use strategy to absorb emissions. And the party's main policies are summarised in For a Fair Deal. This is the pre-manifesto that was adopted by a conference in autumn of this year. And some of the key dimensions of that are to invest significantly in renewable power so that 80% of the UK's electricity is generated from renewables by 2030. Another strand is to provide free retrofits for low-income homes and generous tax incentives for other households. Another is creating a net zero delivery authority. And another is to plant at least 60 million trees a year. So I am going to ask James to come in first. And I guess a key question I'd love to hear your take on, James, is, a lot of dimensions of that policy were agreed in 2019, actually, at the last manifesto. Lots has changed since then. Is this still the right approach? And is there anything big that we're missing? Are there any key gaps?
It is broadly still the right approach, I'd argue. We recently at Business Green hosted our Net Zero Festival and brought together, lots of businesses and policymakers and campaigners. And one of the sort of really interesting things that came out of that is the sense that there really is now quite a mature and established playbook for how you go about delivering net zero, how you go about decarbonising. And the broad brush sort of policy approach you've just sketched out there, it kind of does, it summarises the basics of it. We need to decarbonise the power system as quickly as possible. That means a lot more renewables. And then there'll be discussions about other aspects of it, whether we need, nuclear and hydrogen and other aspects. But essentially, it's decarbonising the power system as quickly as possible, electrifying as much infrastructure as possible. And that means, heat pumps, and electrification through industry and many other aspects, improving energy efficiency, particularly of our housing stock, as quickly as possible, and kind of that's kind of the first wave. Do that over the next sort of two parliaments through to around 2035, and while you're doing that, you're also laying the groundwork for some of the harder to do stuff with investment in early pilot projects and starting to build out the capacity in areas you're going to need, such as more sustainable forms of agriculture, carbon capture and storage around heavy industry, building out a hydrogen industry, not for heating but for other sort of vectors that need to be transformed there. And heavy transport, so shipping and aviation and HGVs and all that sort of stuff will come through the late 2030s into the 2040s. So the broad brush of the strategy that was there in 2019, and if you look at the work of the Committee on Climate Change and others, there's not massive changes. We know what we need to do. The problem is it's very, very politically difficult to do it. And I suppose that brings me to the next question of some of the things maybe you're missing. I mean, the things that arguably that strategy probably doesn't touch on enough are the things that are politically harder. So we're not going to deliver the scale of electrification and low carbon infrastructure that we need without sorting out the planning system. The planning system, and I'm sure Chris will touch upon this in much more detail and know much more about it than I do, but the planning system currently is just not fit for purpose for a decarbonising economy. And obviously, as everyone knows, planning is a very politically challenging electoral issue whenever you try to discuss it. One of the other things we could do quite quickly that would reduce emissions is behaviour change. You know, if there was a concerted program that said we should be eating much less meat and we should be flying a bit less, or we should be using our cars a bit less, or getting in public transport more, all very, very sensible stuff that could deliver massive co-benefits in terms of health, in terms of financial savings, etc., etc. All things that, you know, you could make a very strong case for a government doing. You know, government already you know, tries to encourage us not to smoke or to eat more healthily and all these other things. And yet, once again, politically, that is a very, very charged topic. I mean, we've seen the government trying to weaponise it against Labour by making up things that Labour was never going to do around meat taxes and the like. And yet those sort of policies are arguably quite sensible. They are an effective means of cutting emissions and delivering quite deep and sustained changes. And you know, the list goes on. I mean, carbon removals is another area that's, you know, quite controversial and quite challenging, but arguably something we're going to need to do more on. So that's another space that you could probably have a bit more focus. But I think, yeah, going back to where I started, the broad brush of it is still the same. And this does bring a little bit of a political challenge for the Lib Dems and I suppose Labour as well, is that finding differentiators is quite challenging on the policy level, because it's kind of obvious what needs to be done. It's quite easy to get a differentiator by going the other way, like the government has done, and watering things down and sort of, you know, trying to weaponize it a little bit as a culture war issue. But if you want to be responsible about this, then, you know, the Lib Dems and Labour are going to land in broadly similar places, because we have this established playbook globally that kind of gives us a pretty good sense of what works and what doesn't.
Thanks, James. Now, I want to bring Chris in on this one. You know, so one of the points you've made, James, is that some of the more politically sensitive and contentious things might be missing, or we might need to be saying some more on. Chris, as an elected Liberal Democrat politician who's campaigning on the doorsteps, etc., I mean, would you agree that that's the case? And how do we best grapple with those politically contentious issues?
It depends, I think, on how you frame them. So very often the politically contentious issues are framed in the wrong way. They're framed about doom and gloom. They're framed around choice. We're going to force you to stop doing something. They are framed around insecurity. And all of those are just the wrong way to frame any call to action to anybody in any circumstance. So for me, some of the political work is around trying to frame those issues in terms of the positives, about choice, about what we can do, how we can solve things together, how there are enormous numbers of steps we can take in local government, in central government, and outside of government altogether, long before we get to the really, really difficult stuff. That starts to be about compulsion and triggers all that negative debate. So for me, it's about changing the language of the debate to the positive story.
I completely agree with that. And there's an article I came across in Scientific American magazine where the author at length writes about this exact issue of language and presentation, which we'll maybe come to again later in the podcast. But, you know, a lot of the debate has been about, certainly from the net zero, the pro net zero side, has been about regulating and cutting and restricting. And these are words that feel limiting and maybe backward to some folks. And actually, we need to be thinking more innovatively about our language, so that people realize this is about empowerment and about progress, not about making life worse.
There's an example of that, low traffic livable neighbourhoods. We're about to introduce one in the town I live in, and we all know the language around livable neighbourhoods. It's a negative, a negative discourse. But actually, if you look at the list of projects that people put into the council wanting done, they're very rarely about wanting things done for cars. They're about wanting things done because I can't get my wheelchair along the road because there's no dropped curb, or there's a bollard that stops me cycling, or there's no bus. There are all those sorts of things. And livable neighbourhoods are actually about doing all those positive things. And if you do all of those, you can get a huge amount of choice reintroduced long before you have to start saying thou can't. And we allow that debate to become thou can't far too quickly.
Yeah, and as liberals, the existence but also the presentation of choice is critical to us.
Absolutely.
So Tom, I'm gonna bring you in. So we've spoken about some things that could be missing, although broadly the package, based on panelists so far, feels like the right one. There are some additions that can be made, both in terms of some of the substance, but also the style. Where do you sit on this, Tom?
Well, I want to pick up what Chris was saying, really. I don't think there's anything wrong with the people of this country. And you're right about the way the narrative is structured, but that's not a narrative structured by the people. It's structured by three people whose names we don't know, most of us. And that's Victoria Newton, Ted Verity, and Chris Evans. And they're respectively the editors of Sun, the Mail, and the Telegraph. And we shouldn't confuse what's being said in the newspapers with what the public think. They don't think they know very much more than anybody else about what the public think, and certainly not more than what local councillors who actually encounter with the public every day do. So I wouldn't confuse the public media discourse with what the public is actually talking about or doing. And I think you're much closer, Chris, to what the public is actually doing. And I think James was right, and you were right to point out, Josh, there's no question what the public wants to see us do more about climate change. The issue isn't the shape of package so much as we're just not doing the delivery. And I think that's a really much more important question than kind of tinker around with, what is the best, most important and least important of the different elements. It's pretty clear you've got to do power, you've got to do transport, we've got to do something about buildings. But where I do agree again with what you were saying, in a sense about the narrative and how we now talk about it. Look, there are two real imperatives for any government coming into power right now: bills down, incomes up. And we're not presenting that climate change as about how you get bills down and how you get incomes up. And some of that will actually be about deciding what you don't want to do. Because one of the reasons people are a bit unsure about what's happening, and I include investors as well as the public, is because of inconsistency in the government. And then you have governments which are trying to do all of the above. Well, the one thing you can be absolutely sure about if you try to do all of the above is you won't do enough of what you really need to do. So we really do need to be clearer about what the priorities of decarbonising are. And they very much are actually the things that will get bills down fastest and incomes up fastest.
And I feel like we've segued really nicely into the discussion next around how we best tell a story, a liberal story, when it comes to net zero. So we know people are concerned about climate change, people of all political colours, but we haven't got to a place yet where everyone's on the same page in terms of the type and scale of measures that might be required, that are required to get to grips with this issue. And the path to that is telling a decent story. Chris, in the discussion we were just having, you touched on how we need to adjust our narrative to be talking in more kind of open and inspiring ways, I guess, when it comes to the fight toward net zero. I wonder, what do you think about the term net zero itself? Has the term itself become so toxified by those very newspaper editors that Tom was just referring to, that it serves as a barrier to the cause?
I think to some extent, yes, in terms of that last point. But I want to track back a bit and look at how we tell positive stories and what those stories are. I've already said, I don't think it's about doom and gloom. Doom stories are really powerful at othering. The whole narrative around people coming by boat is doom, we're being overrun, it's somebody else's fault. And doom language is very good at othering, but because here a lot of what we're wanting to do is to get people to change behaviours, doom stories don't work then, because you're saying to somebody, it's your fault, you're doing something wrong. So that's just not the language. I think for me, it's about telling us positive stories about how we can help hard-pressed families and how they can help us give their children a decent future. That's something you care about, the future of your children, what's going to work for them. We have to stress the need for a just transition. And I think one of the differences from 2019, possibly, we talked about just transition in our policy paper, but I think that is now absolutely centre stage, showing how we can do this positively, the positive stories of difference. And I think moving on, it's then positive stories of choice. We're liberals. We're Liberal Democrats. None shall be enslaved by poverty, ignorance, or conformity. And so part of our language and part of our narrative is about how can we help you make choices? What are the things that you'd like to do, but you can't? And how can we enable you to do it? And for some, that's information. For the better off, it's probably information so they can make economic decisions. For some, it's about cash, the cash barrier to making a change. And for some, it's about us sorting out the shared infrastructure so that we're doing the work for people. Nobody wants to harm the planet. It's just sometimes the default option. So some of our narrative is about just flipping the default option, in some cases, very, very quietly. And I think the third thing, going back to that economic security point, I think it's easy to tell climate change as a story of insecurity, because in a way it is. Its first level is a story of insecurity. But actually, climate change may increase insecurity, but climate action reduces insecurity. The whole point of climate action is that if we do something, we are safer. We have become more secure. We have better futures. And so for me, the emphasis on doing something is about helping people to regain control over what's potentially a scary situation, and to feel that actually, because they've done X, the world is just a tiny bit safer and a tiny bit more secure.
Take back control of our climate and our planet.
Well, we should drop the term net zero. I don't think it means anything to anybody. And anyway, there's going to be a massive scandal when people realize that offsets are largely something that's been promoted by traders, not by people who actually really understand what's going on. And there's going to be massive scandal. So I think that whole idea of offsets is going to get blown out of the water. I don't mean to say it's never got a place to play, but you want to be thinking about offsets after you've had the scandal, not before you've had the scandal. Meanwhile, carbon free actually means something to people. And it touches on that thing Chris is saying about opportunity driven rather than constraint driven. So I'm much in favor of dropping it. Let me pick up one other thing that Chris said that I think is really important. You mentioned the point about action. And that actually ought to have been a strong Liberal Dem suite. I mean, pavement politics is exactly the sort of part of the deep culture of Liberal Democrats. And when I think about the thing that's missing a lot in the way that climate change is written and reported, is we're missing all the things people are already doing at local level. There's a massive amount, and James writes about it from time to time. There's a massive amount of stuff going on, but we're not aggregating that. So we're not drawing the attention of policymakers to all the stuff that can be done by people and is being done by people, and which is people doing it for themselves, and which actually, if we put a lot of emphasis on both the local level and therefore on local government and cities' role in doing this, would actually make for a altogether more compelling, not only story, but also machinery for delivery. And if we want to get the planning system, as Chris rightly says, to do better, let's start by giving us some more planners, because you're not going to get good planning with bulldozers, whatever Keir Starmer thinks. You will only get good planning if you resource the planning functions of local government enough to do a good job.
Thanks, Tom. I'd like to come back to that question of behaviour change. And I'd like to get your take on this in particular, James. You know, through Business Green, with the content that you put out, with the events that you organise, you know, your aim is to change and win hearts and minds, to advance innovative ideas, etc. What are you finding is engaging people the most and helping individuals and businesses to change their behaviour when it comes to acting in a way congruent with the net zero agenda?
I mean, that's a very big question. There's lots of factors driving it. I mean, I was struck by your previous little discussion about messaging. Again, at the Net Zero Festival, one of our keynote speakers was Alistair Campbell, who, there's a slightly controversial history, but knows a thing or two about political messaging. And his sort of, it wasn't quite a 3-word slogan, but he said that the message has to be that green is cheaper, fairer, and delivers better living standards. And I think that is a core part of it for the business community, is that they're increasingly seeing that these investments, and they are investments, they're not costs, so there is a distinction. But these investments in these emerging clean technologies deliver cost savings and make them more competitive and deliver reduced exposure to sort of volatile fossil fuel prices. So you're starting to see, particularly at the business level, but then this also does apply at the household level, this sort of understanding that this is fundamentally, it's the economy stupid. This is an economic argument for doing so. You then obviously from a business perspective start to see some of the reputational benefits, and you start to look at particularly the big corporates and the insurance industry, look at the sort of long-term risk profile they face from climate change if it isn't brought under some degree of control. So all of these factors, these sort of macro trends, are kind of pushing everyone in this same direction. And Tom's right. I mean, I find it absolutely maddening the number of stories we write every single day that are just really cool and positive and fascinating. I mean, we've got a story this week about Panasonic, I think it is, electronics company, planning to invest over £100 million in taking one of their factories in Wales and turning it fully zero emission, just basically kitting it out with all the latest stuff, will slash their emissions, slash their energy bills, and create loads of jobs in South Wales. And it's just like, these stories are just not being told, or certainly not being told as widely as you'd expect. Weirdly, not being told by the government either, who you'd think would be desperate to get some positive news stories about the economy out there. So there is this sort of, that's the story. There is this kind of positive narrative that can be told, and that will drive behaviour change, and is driving behaviour change, just not at the pace that we need to see. The question, I suppose, for policymakers is, how do you kind of grease the wheels of this thing? How do you get what is happening anyway to happen faster? And that's just classic carrots and sticks model. You need to be pushing people a bit harder with some of the regulations, but you also do need to be incentivizing and educating and helping people to understand that this is in their best interest to do, because there is this immense inertia, both at the individual and the business level, partly driven by the cost barriers and the fact that a lot of these clean technologies save you money in the long term but have an upfront cost that is higher. So you've kind of got to get around that. Financing is an option, but obviously people are understandably sometimes wary of that. And you've got to sort of work out where those barriers are and start to tear them down. And that's on multiple levels. That is something we're not seeing, even in the areas that are going well. So like, electric vehicles, that market's absolutely flying. And yet there was a report out this week, I think it was the Electric Fleets Coalition. So big companies that want to decarbonize their fleets, there's something like 20 different policy recommendations that would allow them to go faster. Quite small things often, but there's just this constant policy or financial challenges in the way that if we were really serious about doing this as quickly as possible, you would have a government coming in with a mandate to just tear those barriers down.
But Josh, I've got an idea for you, and an idea that you can promote for all your fellow candidates. Why don't you, in a sense, raid James's positive news stories and write in every single, whatever the current little mags that Lib Dem candidates are putting out, why don't you run a series of missing voices where you just tell those stories? Raid, he's got a big inventory of them, so steal them and put them into all those things, but do it missing voices in each of the communities where Liberal Democrat candidates are rising, about what's not being heard, about what's being done in your community. and just do it and be the people to tell that upbeat, positive story that way. But tell it a story in Chris's thing about action, not about what somebody else should do or the government should do or so on, but what is being done by people. People, funnily enough, just like you and me.
Exactly.
Right. And I think that ties in really nicely, Tom, to the point you were making earlier about aggregating, great practice that local authorities and, communities more broadly are getting up to when it comes to the net zero agenda in their respective patches. There's loads of great practice that lots of others can learn from. But one of the things is that so many folks are so busy just doing it and not spending enough time talking about it and promoting it and sharing it. And so through, say, the suggestion that you've put forward there, but there are also many others too, that could be a key way of getting there. I think what's especially interesting to me is that, there's consensus among the panel that linking the green agenda and the net zero agenda to the prospect of reducing bills and easing financial hardship, there's consensus that that's a good idea. And that feels like it should be a relatively simple thing to do, especially at this point in time when not just the country, but the world is facing, cost of living crisis. In Eastbourne, we declared a cost of living emergency. We've got the busiest food bank in the UK here. And so it ought to be the kind of most fertile environment possible to really be pushing this link between net zero and low cost. But I don't feel that we're there yet. I don't feel we've made as much progress as we otherwise might have done. Chris, what do you think is the key barrier there?
I think part of the trouble is that a lot of the schemes that are getting promoted are things like promoting EVs. And you've got a lot of people in the same community saying, look, I run an old banger because it's the only car I can afford to, and I have to have a car because there aren't any buses left, so I can't get to work by any other means. And so we're almost making it sound as if we're talking to the chattering classes, talking amongst themselves, how can they do a bit of conscience clearing? And of course, that's not what's going on, but that's what it comes across as. And so it's about, I think, direct projects that take the opportunities out to people. So, for example, we have lots of advice and grant schemes that help with home insulation. But if you look at who quite often takes them up, they're quite often the middle to better off. And we're not putting those stories in a language that's going to work for somebody who's on working multiple minimum wage jobs all of the hours on earth in order to feed their family. They haven't got time to go and investigate those schemes, to think about what it would mean, to fill in all the paperwork, to sort it out. And it's about how we take schemes out into communities and say, look, this is what can be done to a house like yours. We can fund it. You just have to say to us, yes, you want it done. And we'll make it happen, so that we've got to make it easier for people to make different choices. It's like, to use comparison with healthy eating, there's quite often you hear condescending stuff about, oh, well, some people don't know what healthy eating is. And actually, everybody knows perfectly well what healthy eating is. But when I was talking, I live in an area of priority social need. And when I was talking to people about healthy eating, I got the answer, of course we know what it is. But the bog-offs in the supermarket are unhealthy food. And we don't have time to mess around. We don't have the money to buy anything other than the bog-off. So we buy the bog-off. And to some extent, the same's true with climate, that we're not thinking about actually what people who are struggling to pay their bills need done so that they can exercise choice. They want to exercise choice. There's every bit of evidence says that your income is not related to your commitment to climate action. What it does do is prevent barriers to your ability to do what you want to do. And so we've got to start dismantling those specific barriers that income causes to people's ability to make a change.
Agreed.
There's a way to do that. And James was right to say there are a lot of policy constraints on what people are trying to do, would like to do. Look, let's declare all of our buildings, the leakiest buildings in Europe, least performing energy, the whole of Europe, let's declare them critical national infrastructure. Let's just make it critical. And if it's a choice, I'd rather have our buildings leaks, as it were, closed off than have new roads. I'm not sure we need more new roads, but I'm sure we need to stop leaky buildings. And let's ask the UK Investment Bank to come up with a bunch of products that would help leverage private capital into a spending on that. And let's understand, exactly as Chris was talking about, it's all very well for the middle class to take advantage, but actually what matters for people is the cost of capital. And so we can do things, government can do things to bring the cost of capital down, could use the UK Investment Bank to do that in order to generate more private capital flows. So you end up with a policy solution that enables the kind of things that people in their own homes, in their cities and towns, can play their part. And we're just not coming up with those kind of policy ideas.
It also needs, sorry, Tom, I was going to say, it also, in my view, does need, and I mean, this might actually sort of cut across some liberal traditions slightly, but it's going to need quite significant intervention and support. I mean, there's two reasons for this. One, if you start doing building retrofits at a sort of street by street level, led by the local authority or even central government, whoever it is, you get massive economies of scale. The whole thing becomes cheaper. But you do just have to go in and do it, and you need to help people do it. We've been talking previously. You know, there are lots of these various schemes around, and somebody was asking on Twitter the other day, like, why aren't they getting the take up? And me and another colleague just went back and said that it's just too difficult. So I mean, I've written several times about what I refer to as sort of like between the 8 to 8:30 challenge in the evening, and I've got 2 young kids and a busy job, and I care about this stuff passionately. You know, I work on these issues. If something that needs doing, like applying for a grant or applying for a loan, can't be done in that little 30 minutes that I get to myself before I'm exhausted, when I've also got to cook the dinner, by the way, if it's not doable in that little 30-minute slot, it's not getting done. It's too hard. Even if you have the money, and that's obviously the other issue, you might not have the money, but even if you did have the money, the sort of the administrative barriers to doing this stuff are too difficult. We are going to need a team of people all across the country coming into people's homes and saying, this is what we can do for you. This is what's needed. This is what we can do. And then we're going to have to do it. Because if you make it hard for people, it is just too difficult. And obviously there are precedents for that. We rolled out a gas grid in the 1950s, and then, you know, we're rolling out a broadband infrastructure now, not particularly well, but we're getting there. It has to be seen as that kind of national strategic project, as Tom said.
Yeah, and nobody, to reinforce that, nobody objected to the changeover from coal gas to natural gas. There was no great outcry, even though you had to dig up every street in the country. People are not complaining about what has to happen to get the broadband. They're complaining about the fact it isn't happening fast enough. You've got to dig up every street in a similar sort of way. So there's no real problem about designing policies that do that and deliver at scale at that level, coordinated at a local level. It's just a reluctance of this government actually to give a lead.
Well,
I can remember I can remember the disputes about and the angst about the coal to natural gas change. People were absolutely convinced they get blown up in their houses by natural gas. People really never underestimate our capacity to be scared of change.
And I think you're completely right about that. But actually, the transition was made without riots in the street, without the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and the Sun running major campaigns against it and all the rest of it. And it's exactly true what you say, Chris, about hydrogen. The same is true about hydrogen. Fortunately, because I don't think hydrogen should be in people's houses. There's no good argument for it. But the gas lobby think that.
I think one of the differences between the examples, dare I say, historical examples that you've cited versus the net zero debate is that I think in this debate now, there is still not crystal clarity on who the winners and losers are, so to speak, of the net zero agenda. There isn't clarity as far as the political debate is concerned about the distributional effects and impacts on folks. And so I think it would be great to spend the next chunk of the podcast having a bit of a discussion about that. So fairness is one of the party's key campaigning themes and values. For a fair deal is the slogan that the party's been running with for some time, and perceived fairness is super important when it comes to climate action. So how can we persuade voters that our policies are fair? And what I'm getting at here is less of a kind of style-based, how do we present things, and more how in substance can we ensure that voters know our policies are fair?
I think that goes back to that very first set of questions that you asked around what's changed. And for me, putting the fairness agenda at the front has become critical, because in a cost, Tom was saying, when it's how can I feed the kids and how can I pay my bills and how can I get my income up, then we've got to talk into that agenda. And I think there is direct stuff we can do. And that's about this, putting cash forward, using the public purse to invest in the ways that get the maximum climate action per pound, that actually enables people to cut their costs by the state providing either as grants or loans the capital investment that's needed, that actually the rest of us can to some extent borrow as loans to invest, but actually doing it for people. Remember, we're in a world where some people can't buy a season ticket to use the bus because they can't afford the upfront capital to buy the season ticket. So the bus is more expensive than it would be for somebody who could afford the season ticket. Ditto, they can't afford to buy a bike to work. So they're stuck with whatever old banger they happen to be using. And there's some stuff there that we can directly do that directly attacks the problem of the injustices of climate cost, of energy cost, for example.
James, in your view, I mean,
Josh, if you want to do what Chris has just said, in a sense, talk through that window, some of the things you need to think about is what don't we need to do, because you can't do everything. And here's one thing we don't need to do. We do need to spend £30 billion of public money trying to figure out how to get our bills down in our homes. We do not need to spend £30 billion on building Sizewell. And I kid you not, the only way Sizewell will get built is if public money pays for it. It may not be public money spent through the government. It'll just be public money by putting bills up.
We've just published our local plan, a draft local plan. Our emerging strategy on our local plan. And one of the things there is, an example from that is, why are we still building houses that are not merely not net zero, but are not capable of being made net zero because they're being built with gas boilers and micro-bore central heating? And so our local plan is saying, who knows whether it will survive the inquiry and the government rules, our local plan is saying we actually want to build net zero houses, because that's the marginal extra cost of building them is nowhere near the same, is as heavily outweighed by the savings in cash terms to the people who then live in them, never mind the savings to the planet. So you start to look at places where doing this bit differently has a massive impact on people's cost of living.
James,
that's not state money, that's just changing attitudes.
Quite. As you say, and I think you were the first to mention this in the podcast, largely a behaviour change piece around what people are doing with their private resources, never mind what government is doing with taxpayers' money. But James, I'd love to get your take. What does a liberal just transition look like in your view?
Again, that's another very tricky question, isn't it? I mean, the first thing I say, you mentioned terminology a little while ago. I actually really like the term net zero. I would argue back with Tom on that. I think it's science-based and it's sensible, and I think it's got quite a lot of traction already. But anyway, but I don't like the term just transition, because I just think it's very, very difficult to explain what on earth you mean by that. I think people who work in climate circles understand it, but I think you go out onto the streets and, particularly in the industrial towns that are most exposed to the risks of some of these impacts, and say, oh, we're going to deliver you a just transition. And they're going to look at you and go, what on earth is that? Like, what the hell is it? What does a liberal one look like? Again, I think this is quite tricky, because I think the only way you're going to mitigate some of those risks is through quite a lot of state intervention. And it's one of the aspects of the whole net zero agenda that I worry about the most. Actually, go around the world, go around the industrialized world. There are countless examples of this being done very, very badly from the 80s onwards. I mean, from the 70s, 80s onwards, we are still living in the US and Europe and the UK with the fallout from the disastrous mismanagement of the last industrial transition. And we have immense social economic problems that are very well documented as a result. And so you've got countless examples of what goes wrong in these industrial communities. And there aren't that many great examples all around the world of this being managed very well. I mean, there are a handful, where you have seen investment go in and skills and training opportunities offered, and that you've managed to create the narrative that actually this is a transition that will ultimately benefit you. But there's not that many, unfortunately. So I'm worried about how any government delivers that, particularly when you've got a very tight fiscal envelope as well. We've just had years of the government talking about levelling up and just failing every which way to actually deliver any meaningful change as a result of that. In answer to your question of what a sort of positive response looks like, I think there's a few things. I think it is just going back to that showing, not, show don't tell. You've got to start to get these jobs and this investment going into these communities, and then being able to normalize it and demonstrate to people that actually, having the wind turbine blade factory, having, delivery vehicles that are fully zero emission and electric, having, houses that are upgraded and retrofitted is immensely beneficial to your community and your health and your ultimately your economic prospects. So I think there's an element of we just talk and talk around it, but actually probably the best way to do it is to find a few there's an interesting project that was proposed a few years back about sort of having some trailblazer towns or some trailblazer cities, and just getting a few examples out there of just like, this is what net zero looks like. We're going to do this, and we'll do it in different types of cities. We'll do it in Newcastle, we'll do it in Norwich, we'll do it in Burnley, and places that have different socioeconomic backgrounds, and show people this is what it does. This will make your town a better place, and actually do levelling up properly. I don't think there's a real answer beyond that. Beyond, I suppose, the obvious one, the classically liberal answer would be to put a proper carbon tax on and just step back and let the market fix itself. But let's be honest, that isn't going to happen, and would be very messy even if it did. But that would be your ultimate liberal policy lever to pull.
That wouldn't
be sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I would say that wouldn't be my sort of liberal. That's a total free market liberal.
Yeah.
Because that really would be the antithesis of a just transition. Just transition is about ensuring that everybody can move forward, and that we aren't penalising the poorest, and that we're doing it in a way that is fair to everybody, so that everybody takes some of the burden, but is equipped to not only take that share of the burden, but also to play their part in the change. The change has to happen from all of us. Okay, the wealthy are the biggest problems in some ways, but we all have to make a change, however big or small that might be.
One thing I've argued for years and years about, actually one way to do this is there's got to be more focus on the public sector and decarbonising the public sector. So the last big technological transformation that happened was these things, was your phone, the digital revolution. And I remember as a kid, the first time I saw a computer was in school. You kind of had this situation where these technologies were normalised in our schools, in our offices, in communal spaces, and then they became consumer devices. And I think we've failed a little bit on this front, in that if you did want to make this just and fair, one of the ways to do it would be to say, right, we're going to do electric vehicles, but we're going to do the bus fleet first, or we're going to do solar panels, but we're doing schools, and we're doing supermarkets, and we're doing warehouses, or and hospitals, and really. A, it normalizes it. B, you get the economies of scale. C, you get the cost savings for the public sector. So this is all good, positive stuff. And it does touch on that sense of justice, because these are communal spaces that everyone's using. So I think something that is really badly overlooked, and there's not been nearly enough focus on decarbonising our public services, our public spaces.
I think
James
there's a
is
vast
right
amount.
about.
Go, Tom.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think James is right about the importance of public sector giving a lead. And actually, one of the places where you'll see an enormous outflow of those bottom-up ideas is actually inside the NHS. It's both motivated by the economic constraints, but it's also motivated by the culture of the NHS. I think we need to give James a bit of a lesson in liberal history. The reason I got to university, coming from a council estate in Plymouth, was because of a bloke called Beveridge. And the reason I got there in a healthy state, and though Labour took the credit for creating the welfare state was actually designed by a liberal whose view was exactly as Chris announced it. In a sense, government has a central role, and the state has a central role in making it possible for everybody to contribute. And so I don't think there's any inherent contradiction between being a liberal and having the question the right kind of state intervention, both conceptually and also operationally. Because there are lots of things, and James is right to point that out, lots of examples, including in this country, of the state intervening in a very bad way. Nevertheless, I think we're not going to get to climate change without the state actually taking a lead. And procurement is one of the tools in its own control to do that right away. So there's no excuse for not getting on with that.
I was being slightly facetious with my classically liberal point. I wish to point out I don't wish to start a kind of a liberal Democrat civil war with the different wings of the party, but it's
actually, James, the reason I took you on a bit is because I think one of the problems, and you made the point that there are real obstacles to people doing it. One of the problems is most of our economic analysis is wrong. The idea that you are going to achieve technology transformation in a relatively short space of time by putting a price on carbon seems to me fantasy. Why would you ever think you're going to bring about a major national transformation by the use of a marginal policy tool? So conceptually, even though economic orthodoxy writes it out all the time, it's a real obstacle to thinking the problem through in a way that will get the delivery you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
I'm going to come in and break up the fight over the carbon tax. We'll save that.
Oh, no, we just agreed.
Can I come back to James about his thing of the public sector, though? Because that was a challenge, and I think you're underestimating quite how much the public sector has done. Yeah. Buses, buildings, leading by example. I think a fair criticism is that the public sector is not always out and proud. It doesn't always make enough of what it's doing. It doesn't always do it consistently. So you have poo-driven buses, biomethane buses, you have electric buses and so on, but actually you've still got the diesel one as well, so that it doesn't give a really clear, consistent message to the public. But also, I think there's a constant changing of central government policy. And let's be honest, just about every bus that's bought is bought with a government grant. Major building schemes of any kind tend to be direct grant government funded. And the government funding message changes so frequently that there isn't that consistency. You can say, I've got a long-term plan to change our fleet to electric, for example. You couldn't do that because it would depend on whether there was a government fund this week and there might not be next week. But the other problem we face is, for example, my authority, I'm proud to say, has a principle of trying to do passive house on all new public buildings. But I have a question. We have a real challenge in trying to deliver that. Yesterday I was in a meeting being told new school would cost 10 million. They make it passive house, 15 million. Central government won't foot the bill for that. If I ask local taxpayers to do that, I'm aware that I'm asking local taxpayers to foot that difference, who actually are struggling to pay their energy bills and may be self-disconnecting because they can't afford to pay an energy bill and can't afford to put insulation into their loft to cut their bills. So there's a real question about how the public sector can really make those big showcase differences unless central government is willing to consistently back the delivery of net zero, of passive house or net zero. Sorry, Tom, I know you don't like the phrase.
Oh no, I mean, again, well. just to, I mean, wholeheartedly agree again. There's a hugely positive work. Local authorities are actually one of the biggest sources of, positive energy in this space. The work done by the UK 100 group and others is absolutely fantastic. And there's lots of wonderful case studies all around the country of the kinds of projects that you've mentioned. The problem is with central government not giving them the powers and not giving them the funding. And obviously we know how much it's been cut to deliver these projects that are going to be essential. So to take your example, I completely understand those cost constraints of building that new school. But equally, if we are going to get to net zero, not building in that way will cost more in the long term and is a false economy. And it's ridiculous that central government isn't going, this is a legal standard that you have to reach. And then we'll get the economies of scale into the construction industry so that you can bring those costs down. So this really is a kind of failure of leadership at the top level that forces local authorities and indeed businesses very much in the same boat on this thing to make these kind of economically self-harming decisions. When they don't even want to, they're being forced to do something they don't actually want to do. So it really does come to, if we do, I think what will be fascinating about the next Parliament is if the polls are correct and the Conservatives lose, and whichever way it goes, whether it's a large Labour majority or Labour in some kind of, or something, the polls change massively and it's more of a sort of coalition scenario, you're going to have a government with a mandate to do really bold stuff on this, because both the Lib Dems and Labour are going to have manifestos that are very, very strong on every aspect of it, on the level of investment needed, on planning, on local authority powers, etc., etc. And it's going to be fascinating to watch, because a government with a mandate and B, the willingness to do this stuff could do a lot of really, really impactful things very, very quickly. And it's going to be a really exciting and interesting time as to whether or not that does happen, or whether they get derailed by the editors of those newspapers that Tom mentioned earlier.
Well, James, that's a lovely transition into what will be, now we've nearly hit time, conclusion to the podcast, which is around delivering those Liberal Democrat MPs in Parliament who will be essential to helping to deliver on the net zero agenda. And we only get those MPs if we win in places like Eastbourne. So I wanted to ask you for some advice, just one-liner from each of you. What should I be, in your view, campaigning on in my constituency when it comes to the net zero agenda? What's the single thing that I, together with other candidates in other target seats, what the single thing that we need to encapsulate, or that we need to say, sorry, to encapsulate the Lib Dems' distinctive approach to net zero? I'll start with Tom.
In a sense, I've already told you. You make up for the fact that the not only the newspapers, but the BBC as well, aren't telling people what's already happening. So the single thing you need to do is tell people what is actually being done by other people in your constituency to drive carbon down, but also to actually drive their bills down. And you connect that to how you do incomes up. Use what people are doing. Chris's point, action speaks louder than words. Use that as the way to lead your story about what Liberal Democrats will do. Don't put all the stuff we've been talking about in, because it turns most people off. And the reason James and I are disagreeing about net zero is only a disagreement about communication. Just I do politics, he does journalism. He wants to be accurate, which he's right about. I want to communicate better. And people don't understand net zero, which is why I recommend losing it. Talk about carbon free, then it sounds like you're talking about the future, and it's a different future. And you can do that without using too many words if you say carbon free.
So in one phrase, Tom, show, don't tell. That's what I should do.
Yeah, show, exactly. Show, don't tell. I completely agree with the don't tell remark from Chris.
Great. James, what's the single most influential thing that candidates, maybe of all parties, not just Liberal Democrats, could do to encapsulate a distinctive approach, an effective approach when it comes to net zero?
Now, here's the difficult thing. I don't have an answer to that, because one of the problems with the net zero transition is it's so big. It's just so big. It's so all-encompassing. This is the biggest, fastest industrial revolution, economic transformation in human history, in the history of civilization. So it's about everything. I mean, I've sort of had this argument about, we're living through the kind of climate change theory of everything. It touches on everything. It informs everything from geopolitics to whether to take an umbrella out when it rains. It's this massive, massive world historic transformation that we're going through. So boiling it down to a single message is frankly impossible. And then to complicate it further from a political perspective, from a retail politics perspective, everyone cares about very, very different things. So it is a sense of what is the message that's best tailored for the target voter that you're trying to reach. You mentioned, areas of fuel poverty and hardship in your constituency. So for them, you probably want to be talking about, we're going to come in and make your home more energy efficient. We're going to give you grants to help cut your energy bills. Something that's sort of much more clear like that. For others, it will be this kind of big picture vision of, we're going to save the world. We're going to be the responsible, positive force. For others, we haven't actually touched on this at all, but climate resilience and adaptation. If you're living in a floodplain, you sure as hell want to know that there's actually going to be a decent flood maintenance budget, which we're having serious problems with. So, the list literally goes on and on. I mean, if you're looking for sort of a single overarching slogan, I think Alistair Campbell hit it on the head, and lots of green groups have been saying this for a very long time. It's that positive story of this is cheaper, fairer, better. And there are myriad benefits that would flow from this transformation. But yeah, I have massive sympathy for politicians trying to sell this message, because it's the most complicated, meaningful challenge in the world right now. And there's a lot of complicated, meaningful challenges in the world right now, but this is the big macro one.
So communicate about cheaper, fairer, better. In a nutshell, that would be your key advice. Thank you very much, James. And last but not least, Chris, what would your advice be to myself and fellow candidates?
Apart from keep it simple, I think people like us in this call can get really quite complicated about it and see it's a really complicated story. But I think our communication is about humanizing, about deconstructing it to the scale of the individual person in their lives. And so what people want to know is, what are you doing? What's the action that's reducing risk to me? I live in a flood risk area. If I put out a flood risk alert, I get people telling me, my street's never flooded, you don't know, and you and the experts don't know what you're talking about putting out the alert. But when I say, this is what we've been doing to improve the river flow, to reduce risk, that's a positive message, and that connects to people, and they don't say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. So I'd say actions that make a positive difference to reduce risk, campaigning for things that will make a climate difference and help lower income families. However wealthy your area is as a whole, there are poorer people in it, and everybody welcomes messages that help the lower income people, even if they're not themselves going to benefit from that. And I say, campaign for things that increase choice, campaigns that help people to do different. That don't, we don't have to be, we're not necessarily talking about compulsion, we're talking about helping people to do different. So I'd say humanize it, action to reduce risk, not words, campaigning for things that make a climate difference and help lower income families, and campaigning to increase people's choice. And which stories you use are going to be local ones that work for your community.
Yeah. Humanity, action, impact, choice. All of those, I mean, are themes that have been running throughout this podcast. But yeah, summarize the approach that you're recommending. And I thank you very much for that advice. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've shared some of my takes as we've been through. But to pick up on, one of the points that James made at the very beginning of this episode, I think it's absolutely critical that we engage with the contentious issues and we don't try to sweep them away under the carpet for political convenience's sake. History won't forgive us for that, and nor will humanity, because both of which will end for us at least. How do we best go about that engagement and tackling this bull by the horns, especially when it comes to some of the more controversial stuff? I think that's where language comes in, which we've discussed a lot over the session that we've had, and looking at how to soften some of the controversy by using empowering, inspiring language, using positivity rather than coming from a kind of deficit-based place of cutting and restriction and reducing and controlling, but also language aside, showing and not telling when it comes to the distributional effects and impact of some of these policies on communities, on individuals, on their families. The public, sadly, aren't in enough numbers buying the vision and the prospect. We need to trial it, and it's already being done in so many great places across not just the UK, but across the world. And we need to show it to people because seeing is absolutely believing. There's so much more, but those are some of my key takeaways that I'll absolutely be implementing in my own campaigning. And I hope that Liberal Democrats and those indeed from other parties who are listening to this podcast are able to find nuggets of inspiration themselves in what has been such an awesome discussion to help take the net zero or whatever we want to call it debate further for the sake of humanity, for the sake of our climate, for the sake of our planet. So thank you so much to Chris Willmore for joining us, Tom Burke for joining us, and to James Murray for joining us as well. And thank you to you lovely listeners at home or at work or on your commute, wherever it might be, for tuning in to this podcast. Thanks so much.